finished speaking. Consistent with HRES 8 and the accompanying regulations, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when they are not under recognition to eliminate background noise. I see that we have a quorum. We'll now recognize myself for opening remarks. Pursuant to notice, we are holding a hearing on the COVID-19 pandemic recovery in the MENA region. Today's hearing will examine the consequences of COVID-19 on the Middle East and North Africa and how U.S. policy can help facilitate the region's recovery. It is clear we won't be able to claim victory over COVID-19 until we stop its spread worldwide. Therefore, containing the virus in the MENA region is crucial to both the health and security of Americans and also to understanding the political, economic, security, and humanitarian trends that will shape the area for the coming years. A true global recovery will require sustained U.S. leadership that harnesses American ingenuity, expertise, and resources, and will require working closely with our allies and partners, including those in the Middle East. An estimated 20 million people have been displaced in recent years by conflict in the region, creating conditions that promote the spread of COVID-19 and innumerable second-order consequences. Migrant worker, refugee, and internally displaced person populations are especially vulnerable to COVID because of high population density and restricted access to healthcare, sanitation, and accurate information. Isolation and lockdowns acted as accelerants of other social challenges facing displaced communities, including domestic violence, mental health, and barriers to education. COVID-19 also severely diminished the effectiveness of the international humanitarian response to these crises due to disruptions in global supply chains, shipping interruptions, travel restrictions, and delays in decision-making. We've also seen that COVID-19 disproportionately affects women and girls. Women in the MENA region face barriers to healthcare access and disparities in quality care. They make up a majority of healthcare workers and often assume caregiving responsibilities that expose them to infection. Moreover, social isolation has contributed to a spike of domestic violence, just as economic desperation has led to a spike in child marriages. As lockdowns were imposed, demand for energy plummeted, and with it, MENA economies that are bound to the global price of oil. Energy prices recently rebounded, but COVID has accelerated a global transition away from fossil fuels, reiterating the need for economic diversification, a task made more complicated by rising debt levels, diminished growth, and additional resources devoted to rebuilding public health systems. Furthermore, many economies in the MENA region, such as those in Tunisia, Morocco, and Egypt, are heavily reliant on foreign tourism, which remains limited, posing additional economic challenges. Taken together, all these challenges, vulnerabilities, and pitfalls underscore the urgency and care with which the Biden administration must act to mitigate the spread of COVID-19 in the MENA region. As of late April, the State Department and USAID have provided more than $225 million in COVID-19 related assistance to the MENA region. That will help mitigate many of the problems I've outlined, and I applaud these efforts, but I'm concerned by reports of the delayed disbursement of emergency funds appropriated by Congress. These funds must be obligated if we are to truly defeat the virus and put the region and the world on a path to full recovery. Finally, we must not forget that our most powerful tool of all is the vaccine. And I'm hopeful that a reported overhaul to the multilateral COVAX mechanism will allow millions of additional vaccines to reach MENA countries promptly. I also applaud the Biden administration for having an ambitious plan to distribute vaccines globally, including many of the states in the MENA region. I encourage the administration to prioritize distribution to our closest allies and partners who need vaccines and trust the sterling record of American vaccines over the mixed records of those produced by Russia, China, and Iran. In fact, the rapid development, production, and distribution of the U.S. vaccine and its overwhelming effectiveness is a strong testament to American innovation and scientific prowess. We should do more to spread this message globally and in the MENA region to counter Chinese and Russian misinformation campaigns about U.S.-made vaccines, which is nothing more than a cynical effort to tarnish American ingenuity and generosity in favor of a more transactional form of diplomacy. We have a distinguished panel of experts to address these issues. I'd like to thank them for their time in joining us. I look forward to their testimonies. And I now yield to the ranking member, Mr. Wilson of South Carolina, for his opening remarks.
Chairman, Speaker Pro Tem Ted Deutsch, I want to thank you for calling this important hearing to examine how the Wuhan virus pandemic has impacted the Middle East. In addition to widespread sickness and loss of life, the last year and a half has resulted in economic, social, and political challenges that will alter the Middle East for years to come. I'm grateful for the partnership that exists between the United States and Israel in health and technology innovation, and I am hopeful that expanding partnerships with Israel will produce positive outcomes in the region. I thank our witnesses for being here today to help us make sense of these developments and determine how the United States government should respond. People throughout the Middle East, including refugees and internally displaced persons, are relying on donated vaccines to protect them from illness. I hope that you can tell us more about the outlook and obstacles for vaccinating these most vulnerable populations. Additionally, we must ensure the vaccines are fairly distributed within a country and do not become subject to manipulation or diversion. As an example, reports indicate the Iranian-backed Houthi rebels have failed to report confirmed cases and deaths, and that no vaccines have reached the areas under Houthi control in Yemen. The Middle East and North Africa economic recovery is projected to be moving slower relative to other regions, according to the World Bank. I hope our witnesses can shed some light on varying patterns of recovery across the Middle East and North Africa, especially as it relates to emerging countries in conflict states. I agree with Chairman Deutsch that the global recovery is important to American families. It is apparent that the slow economic recovery is hurting people across the region, many of whom have already endured years of political upheaval and instability to malign influences and authoritarianism. Are the governments in power adopting more restrictive policies to paper over this growing discontent? What is the outlook for further political transitions in the Middle East? Additionally, I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on how bad actors like Russia, China, Iran, Hezbollah, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Hamas, and the Houthis are exploiting the vulnerabilities throughout the region for their benefit at the expense of innocent civilians. Additionally, how effective are the vaccines being produced by China, by Russia, by Iran? I want to thank you for your important work and for sharing this analysis and experience with us today. I look forward to your testimony. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. I'll now introduce our distinguished witnesses. I want to note for the members and those watching that one of our previously noticed witnesses unfortunately had a last-minute medical issue, could not appear today. His name has been removed from the hearing notice. Ms. Carla Humud is an analyst in Middle Eastern affairs at the Congressional Research Service. She covers Syria, Lebanon, and the Islamic State for the Middle East Africa section of CRS's Foreign Affairs, Defense, and Trade Division. Ms. Eman Moankar is the Communications and Advocacy Director for CARE International, supporting the MENA region, based in Amman, Jordan. Prior to joining CARE, Ms. Moankar worked in various capacities in international humanitarian affairs in the MENA region, including the International Committee of the Red Cross, service with UN agencies as regional representative, and working with the International Council of Voluntary Agencies. She has worked around the globe, including Iraq, Yemen, West Bank, Gaza, Jordan, Libya, and Egypt. And finally, Mr. Hallam Ferguson is a public policy fellow at the Wilson Center. He previously served as the Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator at USAID from 2017 to 2021, where he managed the Middle East Bureau. Prior to joining USAID, Mr. Ferguson worked at the International Republican Institute from 2004 to 2017, conducting democracy and governance programming throughout the Middle East. I thank all the witnesses for being here today. I'll now recognize the witnesses for 5 minutes each, and without objection, your prepared written statements will be made a part of the record. Ms. Humud, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Deutsch, Ranking Member Wilson, members of the committee, for inviting me to testify today on behalf of the Congressional Research Service. I'll summarize my written statement by speaking briefly about some of the social, economic, and political impacts of COVID-19 in the Middle East and North Africa region, or MENA, and the possible regional outlook in light of the effects of the ongoing pandemic. Pandemic has exacerbated existing challenges in the MENA region, weakening national economies in ways that potentially could impact political stability. I'll start by discussing the most affected populations, followed by economic and political developments. While the impact of COVID-19 has been widespread, its effects have been especially severe among the region's most vulnerable populations, including refugees and displaced persons, migrants, and women and girls. The MENA region includes several states experiencing protracted armed conflict and/or humanitarian emergencies, and MENA produces and hosts the largest numbers of displaced populations worldwide. Refugee and internally displaced populations frequently lack adequate access to health services, and many also depend on the informal labor market, which has been significantly impacted by the pandemic. Migrant workers constitute the majority of the population in some Gulf states, such as the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain. International organizations reported that migrant workers in the region faced arbitrary dismissals and unpaid wages during the pandemic, and in some cases were unable to access emergency cash assistance available to citizens. Migrant workers also reported being unable to access health services in some countries due to their status as foreign nationals. Women constitute a majority of workers in the informal sector in MENA, where they often lack social or legal protections. Pre-pandemic, the MENA region had the lowest rate of female labor force participation among world regions, and some worry that the pandemic will have further negative effects on women's employment in the region. In June 2021, the World Bank estimated that the region's GDP contracted by nearly 4% in 2020, resulting in a significant increase in regional unemployment, particularly youth unemployment. Decline in global demand for some of the region's key exports, including tourism services and oil, the price of which declined by an average of 32% in 2020 relative to 2019, also exacerbated local economic challenges. The region's government revenue fell by 24% from 2019 to 2020, and due to the increased demands on public spending, the World Bank estimates that average fiscal deficits in 2020 as a share of GDP roughly doubled from their pre-pandemic forecasts from 4.6% to 9.4%. The World Bank estimates that the region's public debt will grow from 46% of GDP in 2019 to 54% of GDP in 2021, which would be the largest increase in the past 2 decades. In 2020, the UN Secretary General warned that the COVID-19 pandemic could, quote, provide a pretext to adopt repressive measures for purposes unrelated to the pandemic, end quote. New measures adopted by some MENA states in response to the pandemic have had the effect of limiting expression. Some states have tightened the penalties for the spread of false information in ways that could be broadly applied beyond the context of the current pandemic. Finally, economic challenges, predating but exacerbated by the pandemic, have intensified political unrest in some MENA states. Economic recovery in the MENA region appears to be on a slower trajectory relative to some other regions. The World Bank projects global growth of 5.6% in 2021, with the MENA region forecast to grow at 2.4%. There is considerable divergence in economic outlook among countries. Oil exporting countries, which are benefiting from the return of oil prices to pre-pandemic levels, are expected to recover more quickly. In contrast, the countries entering the pandemic in states of conflict, political instability, or economic crises, and those most dependent on tourism face the prospect of long-term economic challenges. Overall, the World Bank expects economic activity in the region to remain roughly 6% below pre-pandemic projections through 2022. Finally, deteriorating economic conditions could undermine political stability, with unemployment and underemployment serving as a potential driver of popular grievance against regional governments. Furthermore, it is possible that destabilizing political trends could grow out of COVID-related economic challenges, particularly if governments are seen as unable or unwilling to meet the needs of the population. This concludes my testimony. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Humud. Next, Ms. Moankar, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Deutsch, Ranking Member Wilson, and distinguished members of the committee for this opportunity to testify and for the commitment shown to respond to the pandemic in low and middle income countries. I just had my second dose of the vaccine, but millions of other women in the region are not as fortunate. Like Raida, a young widow from Yemen who not only cannot get vaccinated, but has also lost her only source of income, as staying at home to protect herself and her kids from the virus means staying without food. Millions of women had been struggling before the outbreak. They are made vulnerable by ongoing conflicts in the region, fragile economies, governance challenges, protracted and recurrent displacements. They are pushed to resort to extreme negative coping mechanisms to survive, like child marriage, child labor, and skipping meals altogether in many cases. The pandemic's devastating impact, including loss of livelihoods, reduced remittances, falling incomes, interrupted vaccination programs, increased unemployment, increased gender-based violence, and deepening poverty mean that more people will need support in a region that hosts over half of the total displaced population worldwide. Access to medical care is not available for women in Syria. The pandemic has pushed Syrians to a breaking point, with the number of people in need growing 20% in the last year alone. Over 70% of healthcare workers have fled the country, placing an enormous burden on those who remain and are a target for violent attacks. The destruction of water and sanitation systems have also made COVID-19 prevention an uphill battle for the displaced in crowded settings. Furthermore, 1 million people will be put at risk with the looming potential failure of the UN Security Council to renew a resolution authorizing life-saving aid delivered cross-border that will also compromise the COVID-19 response in Syria. In Yemen, a country that inches closer to social and institutional collapse due to the conflict, poverty, deteriorating public services, and the dire economic crisis, the pandemic is still surging, pushing the healthcare system to collapse. Civilians in Yemen continue to endure severe threats to their lives. Furthermore, malnutrition and starvation, hindering and blocking access to aid by warring parties have also disproportionately impacted Yemeni women and girls. In Gaza, COVID-19 has severely aggravated the socioeconomic and health conditions. As a result of the blockade in Gaza, the humanitarian needs have soared. The escalation of hostilities in May killed hundreds of civilians on both sides and wounded over 10,000, the vast majority of them in Gaza. It displaced more than 113,000 people across Gaza and has caused significant damage to the already fragile health infrastructure, including the main COVID-19 laboratory, forcing a cessation of testing. The resources to respond to the crisis and the latest emergency needs are severely lacking. The international community only provided 7% of the required 95 million needed to reach 1.1 million Palestinians for 3 months. COVID-19 is increasing short-term humanitarian needs and negatively affecting long-term outcomes for millions in the region, significantly setting back hard-won development gains and magnifying inequalities. If left unaddressed, conflict and violence, political and economic instability, and food insecurity will continue to rise. US government leadership is critical to not only providing resources, but also spurring necessary political action and global collaboration to end violence in the region. We urge the US government to prioritize the following areas. First, supporting displaced populations and women and girls affected by COVID-19 and ensuring those investments have a clear gender focus. Second, investing in global COVID-19 response and vaccine justice and equity by supporting frontline and community health workers in vaccine delivery to the last mile. Third, addressing the deepening humanitarian needs in the region by making civilian protection and accountability for international law a first-order priority in the US broader engagements, as well as doubling down on diplomacy to resolve the root causes of conflict and crisis. Thank you, Congressman Deutsch, Wilson, and all distinguished members, and I too look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Ms. Moankar. Mr. Ferguson, you are now recognized.
Thank you. Chairman Deutsch, Ranking Member Wilson, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today on this important topic. COVID-19 has killed nearly 200,000 people in the Middle East, according to official figures, and likely far more. As elsewhere in the world, the pandemic has taken a tremendous human and economic toll, but the wholesale collapse of societies has not yet taken place, contrary to many dire predictions. So today I'd like to look past the immediate crisis of COVID and refocus our attention on the long-term causes of instability in the Middle East. These stressors preceded COVID, were exacerbated by it, and will now reemerge worse than ever. You've already heard about the grave economic situation in the Middle East, and I'd like to focus on what I believe is an even more fundamental challenge: weak, ineffective governance. Ultimately, tax codes, regulation, and the business environment are set by government. Education policy is set by government. It was poor governance, as well as the lack of opportunity it perpetuated, that drove the Arab Spring uprisings of 2011. But a decade later, the governments that emerged from or survived the Arab Spring have failed to meet the original demands of the protesters. As far back as 2019, we were already seeing the second wave of the Arab Spring coming in. That year, protests forced the resignation of leaders in Algeria, Sudan, Iraq, and Lebanon. In each case, protests were met by a panicked mix of concessions and violence, but little serious systemic change, showing that regional governments today are no better equipped to address popular demands than they were a decade ago. Then, in 2020, the demonstrations quieted under the smothering blanket of COVID-19 and repressive emergency ordinances. Press freedoms were severely curtailed and public gatherings all but prohibited by governments across the region, including those that we had previously considered relatively open. Jordan joined Egypt, Lebanon, and others in coercing journalists and civil society through draconian restrictions and outright violence. Despite conditions, protests never entirely disappeared, and now that COVID is receding, citizens will emerge from quarantine to find economies even more sluggish, corruption more pervasive, education more broken than they were at the start of protests in 2019. According to the Arab Barometer, in 2019, only 29% of Moroccans and Tunisians were satisfied with their education systems before the pandemic caused the better part of a year's learning loss among children. In 2019, only 38% of Jordanians said they had trust in their government before the pandemic caused 1 in 4 Jordanians to lose their jobs. So what can we do? What is required is very hard. To preserve stability, governments in the Middle East need to demonstrate tangible improvements in citizens' lives this year. They need to be transparent, responsive, and effective right now. Within 18 months, it will likely be too late, and popular discontent will become overwhelming. It was already overwhelming before COVID. Given this urgent timeline, I would make several recommendations. First, focus. Focus our resources, both financial and diplomatic, on those countries where we have the influence and the scale to help governments undertake urgent and difficult reforms and weather the short-term fallout. With our help, regional allies need to demonstrate quick wins for their populations and then communicate those wins widely and loudly. Close regional allies such as Jordan, Tunisia, and to a lesser extent Morocco are vulnerable and will require support. COVID vaccines make up an important part of this short-term assistance, as there's no better vehicle for concretely helping people and economies recover. The new president and CEO of the Wilson Center, Ambassador Mark Green, recently hosted former Prime Minister Tony Blair for his institute's report on the global vaccination effort. The report's recommendations included a rigorous prioritization of dense urban and essential worker populations. In the Middle East context, I would propose a further priority for our allies most vulnerable to instability. 40% of Jordan's population lives in Amman, and Jordan will face acute stability challenges this year. By comparison, Yemen's population is dispersed and difficult to reach and has no stability to lose. Global coordination of vaccine distribution is essential, but an over-reliance on multilateral instruments such as COVAX will reduce our ability to strategically focus our effort and mute the public diplomacy effect of this life-saving aid. People in the Middle East need to know that the United States is standing with them, and they need to see our flag. Too many of them only see China's. Finally, in those countries where we don't have the scale or the resources to help governments through this immediate turbulence, stay focused on the long term. Presidents and prime ministers come and go, but systems remain. And it's those systems that our development professionals are helping improve inch by inch and year by year. Stagnant, state-centered economies are not transformed into vibrant private sector job creators in a year. We must not lose sight of our long-term vision for a prosperous and stable region, even if today seems consumed by chaos. Thank you again for the opportunity to present this testimony, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ferguson. Thanks to all of our witnesses for being here today. I will now recognize the members for 5 minutes each. Pursuant to House rules, all time yielded is for the purpose of questioning the witnesses. Because of the virtual format of the hearing, I'll recognize members by committee seniority, alternating between Democrats and Republicans. If you miss your turn, let our staff know, and we will circle back to you. If you seek recognition, you must unmute your microphone and address the chair verbally. I will defer my time and start by recognizing the vice chairman of the full committee, Mr. Malinowski, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I'm gonna pass for the moment and come back a little bit later. That's okay.
Sorry. It is. Mr. Sherman was on. Mr. Sherman, are you back? I'm not seeing you. We'll go to Mr. Vargas. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, thank you for holding this important hearing, and I especially want to thank the witnesses that have testified here today. I would like to talk about the issue of the gender focus that Ms. Moankar spoke of. One of the things that was maybe alarming, or maybe I misunderstood you, was that women were not receiving the vaccines because of their gender in some places. Was that what you were attempting to tell me and I didn't understand fully? Or why are women not getting vaccines at the same level as men? Ms. Moankar?
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's not that usually women and girls are the most vulnerable among the civilian population. And when I mentioned that millions of women do not have access, these women are affected by the conflict in Syria, in Yemen, in Gaza, where even if sometimes the vaccine is available, the delivery system does not reach them. Women has been really suffering the consequences of the conflict. And if we talk about women in Yemen and Syria, for example, particularly in remote areas and in crowded settings, where even humanitarian assistance is hardly reaching them, they've been assuming even to new roles to go out and be a breadwinner for the family on top of their taking care of the house and the kids. And with the lockdowns, this also has pushed them to work in environments that lacks protection, rights, where they receive really minimum wages. So yeah, on many occasions, for example, some women in Gaza or even in Yemen, they prefer to go out, work, to feed their kids, and maybe not to queue to go get the vaccine. This is in addition to that the vaccine is not reaching the majority of the population in the countries in MENA region, particularly in conflict zones. And yes, and women are the most affected by the pandemic and the security situations and the conflicts in the region.
Okay, so then maybe I misunderstood when you first stated it. So the issue more is the delivery system, the necessity of women to work to make sure that they can feed their family. It isn't that they're being discriminated against because they're women then. You said that there should be a gender focus, but you're not saying that's because their women are getting discriminated against. It's just simply the delivery system. Is that correct?
No, actually, it's all kinds of reasons. If you look at the repercussions of COVID-19, and especially during lockdown on women, the rise in gender-based violence, including intimate partners, has been increasing tremendously. Child marriage, girls are being married as of 14 and 13 years old. These are, we cannot just decide one factor. They're in Yemen, in Afghanistan, or in Syria, or in Gaza. They are facing all these challenges. For example, the percentage of women, of healthcare workers who are working in remote areas and are the only link to the population affected, civilian population, refugee and displaced, are not well equipped and supported or paid to do their job. Those women are the link between the vaccine delivery and the civilian population.
I'm going to have to interrupt you just because my time is almost over. The only thing, I agree with everything you said, and thank you. The only thing that I would add is this. I think we should make vaccines available throughout the Middle East, but I also think we should have the American flag on every vial to let people know it's coming from the United States of America, that we support them. But anyway, I hope we do it, and I hope we put the flag on there. And I thank you very much for your testimony. I yield back. My time's up. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Vargas. The ranking member, Mr. Wilson, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm grateful to follow Congressman Vargas because, again, we agree. And so I'm really, I just want to echo, indeed, the American flag. What a wonderful suggestion, and I'm not surprised that Congressman Vargas is being proactive. Additionally, I want to thank each of the witnesses. It's really heartfelt what you're saying and what this means to the people who are so gruesomely affected throughout the region. And then, Mr. Ferguson, I want to thank you for your service with IRI. I've had the opportunity to be an election observer for IRI in Bulgaria. I've had the opportunity to promote democratic participation with IRI in Russian Siberia and Slovakia. And I know you make a difference. And so, Mr. Ferguson, you've cited that countries in the Middle East using the pandemic as an excuse or delaying political and other transitions. Have there been changes in laws regarding freedom of assembly in Middle East countries during the last 16 months? And have any of these laws subsequently been relaxed? Or are you concerned that any of these laws will be abused to limit dissent and protest?
Thank you, Congressman, for your question. Most of the laws restricted freedom of expression or assembly over the last 12, 18 months in the form of emergency ordinances of one sort or another, i.e. short-term legal interventions, which were extremely restrictive and were often accompanied by violence. Many of these ordinances are beginning to be relaxed, but I think there is a very legitimate concern among the human rights community that they will not be entirely relaxed or will be reimposed under the guise of controlling potential new resurgences of the disease of COVID. And again, to reiterate some of my earlier points, these restrictions, this repression happened not just in what we consider a very strict or authoritarian context, but even in some more open societies, such as Morocco or Jordan or even Tunisia. And the protests that are resulting from that are indeed beginning to be felt already.
Thank you for that input. And Ms. Humud, to what extent are China and Russia engaging in vaccine diplomacy and to expand their influence? If so, which countries and where can the United States best compete with China and Russia? And also, what is the effectiveness of the vaccines from China and Russia?
Thank you, Congressman. Russia and China have both used vaccine supply as sort of a tool of soft power in the MENA region. So some analysts argue that while states in Europe are on domestic vaccination campaigns, it could potentially leave a window for countries such as Russia and China to expand their influence in MENA. So, for example, the Chinese Sinopharm vaccine is one of the primary vaccines being used right now in UAE and Morocco. Sinopharm has also been used in Egypt, Bahrain, Iraq, Algeria. The Russian Sputnik vaccine has been distributed in the West Bank and Gaza, also in Syria, in Iran, and UAE. In terms of the effectiveness of the Russian and Chinese vaccines, I'm not a public health person, so I can't speak to that, but I can put you in touch with some of our CRS experts on that.
Hey, thank you very much for getting back on that. And Ms. Moankar, which countries have seen their economic situations most negatively impacted? Can you discuss the differences of the different countries that are being so negatively impacted?
Thank you very much. Actually, I will again focus on the countries that are affected by the conflict. A country like Yemen with a collapsing system, people are pushed to famine and starvation, unfunctioning government, the same, but I mean, the economic situation is affecting everybody. Look at the situation in Lebanon that is very closely also linked and affecting Syrian refugees in the region. Inside Syria, even Jordan as a middle income country, Egypt, I think we're going to see the repercussions of the economic downfall. I mean, from now on, we haven't felt it during the pandemic as much as we feel it now. For example, today in Jordan, there's this talk all over the media with the prices increase of 20%. 20% for food is great. It's a great increase. Also, fuel prices, unemployment rates, it's reaching 50% according to the World Bank among the youth in Jordan. And this is a middle income country and is greatly supported with humanitarian aid. But when you compare to countries who are affected by conflict and protracted crisis, this also takes you to another level of problems. Can I add something in relation to the vaccine acceptance and let's say the way, for example, people in Jordan and in other countries in the region see the American vaccine. This is something because I've noticed that this is of importance, and I think it is important. From a personal experience living in Jordan and being a Jordanian too, and seeing the way people interact with the vaccine, but just for your info. For example, when there's the American vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine, which is available now in Jordan, when it's available, vaccination centers are packed. Hundreds of people go, even if they are not registered. If they are registered and they are having their appointments on a certain day and they go and they don't find that it's Pfizer vaccine, they go back. They cancel the appointment. They take the risk of being not vaccinated for another few weeks or few months to be able to get the Pfizer vaccine. So, I mean, this is the case, I think, in Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and yes, there is a great trust by the population, but this is a personal observation I wanted to share with you.
Thank you for your insight. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. We can go to Vice Chair Malinowski if you're ready. Otherwise, we'll go to Mr. Sherman.
Sure, I can go if that's okay.
Mr. Malinowski, you're recognized.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to our witnesses. And just picking up on where we just left off, I think we all agree that it's important for people to know that the vaccines that they're getting courtesy of American ingenuity and diplomacy are in fact American. But I just want to ask the witnesses to confirm my impression that whether they're labeled or not, people know the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine are in effect American vaccines, whether there's an American flag on the vial or the package or not. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, if I might answer, I went to get my vaccine, but I didn't see what they used. But I know it was Pfizer, but no branding. That, if you were asking for.
Right, but you know that Pfizer is.
Yes, yeah, American. Yes, yes,
Exactly.
yeah. Everyone knows
Yeah.
that Pfizer is American. Well,
Right.
many people.
So, I'm generally for branding things, but I think in this case, the branding is just, it goes without saying that these are the products of American industry and ingenuity, of course, some of our allies as well. It also wanted just to confirm with you, my understanding is that some of the wealthier countries in the region, the Gulf states that have far more advanced vaccination programs, are now beginning to offer Pfizer and perhaps other of the advanced vaccines as a booster shot for people who took the Chinese vaccine initially. Can anybody confirm that? I think that's the case. So I think also just another important data point here for us, that there is a growing understanding that there is a difference between these vaccines, and that the Pfizer, Moderna, J&J shots that we helped develop are the ones that people rely on. And I think just to make a broad comment about that, I think there's an extraordinary strategic opportunity with the United States that we're just beginning to take, but haven't really fully seized. We, of course, all know that President Biden recently announced that the United States government would be purchasing 500 million doses of the Pfizer vaccine, specifically for distribution to lower income countries around the world. And many of our friends in the Middle East will be benefiting from that. But when you think about the scale of the global challenge, we're going to need at least 11 billion doses of effective vaccine to get to even just 70% vaccination rates among the global population. And so 500 million is actually less than 5% of what it's going to take. And the United States is almost a quarter of the global economy. So I don't think we're quite doing our share just yet. And many of us have urged the Biden administration to keep going, to keep building on the announcements they've made, and in effect to add a zero to the number that was recently announced. In that spirit, let me, and again, this can go to any of the witnesses, but let me ask you to comment on the challenge in Iran as well, where the humanitarian imperative is as great as anywhere else. The politics are much more complicated, particularly for the United States. But I could see that we might still have here a strategic opportunity to be able to deliver something to the people of Iran that their government and their government's allies in the world are unable to deliver. And I wonder if any of our witnesses might have any thoughts or suggestions on that score.
Congressman, I'm happy to take an initial stab at this, and Carla, if you want to add anything. I would only comment that I am skeptical that the Islamic Republic of Iran, especially given their new president, is going to be particularly eager to see any significant donations from the United States. In the past, when we've attempted to make humanitarian overtures, they've rejected those efforts. And they're now touting their own domestically produced vaccine, which, effective or not, I suspect will be their go-to, as well as anything they get from China and Russia. So I think you're right. And to earlier comments regarding America's sort of larger brand when it comes to Pfizer, Moderna, and other effective vaccines, it is an opportunity in Iran, but I'm skeptical practically if that's something that they take us up on.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Malinowski. Representative Jackson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for your testimony today. I'm extremely proud of the American ingenuity shown in developing 3 safe and effective vaccines in the fastest timeline ever. I believe we now have an opportunity to assist the rest of the world, particularly our friends and allies in the Middle East, by distributing these vaccines. Mr. Ferguson, I appreciated and agreed with the portion of your testimony that discussed assisting close regional allies with vaccines rather than relying on multilateral institutions like COVAX for distribution. In my opinion, the United States leadership in COVID vaccine is an opportunity to work with foreign governments to promote democracy and demonstrate the power of the free market and capitalism. It's not vaccine diplomacy if we're not using our influence at the same time. I'm not proposing that we hold off on, but I just think that we need to take advantage of the opportunity we have here to make new friends and to build relationships. Can you speak more to the power of vaccine diplomacy? Also, what recommendation would you make to the Biden administration on allocating and distributing vaccines in contrast to the strategy we are seeing from Russia and China?
Thank you, Congressman Jackson. All very good questions. So with regard to the vaccine diplomacy of Russia and China and how we might contrast, look, I think we've touched on a lot of this already in this discussion. It's increasingly evident that especially Chinese vaccines are not as effective as ours. And Russian vaccines are simply not produced at scale adequate for the global need. And so this really is a huge opportunity for United States ingenuity and industry to step ahead here and help our friends in the Middle East and elsewhere. China's been I'd say baldly opportunistic when it comes to providing its vaccines. It's evident that they are seeking direct influence in who they choose to provide these vaccines to. And I would argue that the United States already is, I think, taking a much more global, holistic, and generous approach. And I applaud the Biden administration for stepping forward in providing these vaccines or pledging to do so. We are the greatest donor at this point of vaccines, at least pledged. And at this point, I think we need to, as I mentioned in my testimony, both meet the needs around the world, but also not lose this opportunity to focus in on those countries, especially in the Middle East, that are most vulnerable to true instability. We're not out of the woods yet in terms of COVID. And we'll still see countries see acute instability. And in good close friends such as Jordan or Tunisia, we've got a real opportunity to make sure that they're taken care of with these vaccines.
Yes, sir. Well, thank you for that. I appreciate it. I got about a minute and a half left here, but just one more question. As of March 2021, USAID IG report found that the USAID has only obligated $3.3 billion of the $11.2 billion in the emergency funds it had received from Congress. Ms. Ferguson, could I hear from you on your experience at USAID during the Trump administration? What did you find were the best practices in quickly and effectively distributing funding through USAID? Also, what recommendations would you have for Congress to help speed this process up and provide adequate oversight on the use of taxpayers' funds?
Thank you for this question, and it could be a very extensive answer, so let me try to stay focused in the minute and change we have left. But it's a very important question. So 2 parts. First, on my experience on the distribution of funds and assistance through USAID, and then secondly, what Congress can do to help. First, USAID is burdened by a great deal of important regulatory requirements to make sure that USAID spends its funds appropriately. This is taxpayer money, and we want to do it without losing any, without inadvertently helping bad actors like the Houthis or other terrorist groups. But I'd say in terms of the delay, especially where COVID is concerned last year, a great part of that was strategic, in fact. It was a long debate internally as to who and where efforts should be directed. But secondarily, I think procurement reform is something that the Trump administration prioritized at USAID to try and make things speedier, faster. And we did our best to try to cut some of the red tape to move faster there. And that is something that Congress can help. I am hopeful that the Biden administration will continue that effort at USAID. And Congress can help by understanding and trying to work with USAID to identify those regulatory requirements that are necessary and perhaps those that can be sunsetted. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ferguson. I appreciate it. I yield back, sir.
Thank you very much, Representative Jackson. Representative Manning, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for testifying before us today. I'd like to talk a little bit about what's going on in Syria. We know that the UN Security Council will vote in July on extending the border crossing at Bab al-Hawa, which is the only access point for cross-border humanitarian aid into northwest Syria right now. Russia and the Assad regime have already closed 3 of the 4 border crossings in recent years. Can you talk about how the closure of Bab al-Hawa would impact COVID migration and vaccine efforts in Syria? And this can go to any of the witnesses who'd like to talk about this.
Sure, I can start on that. UN officials have really emphasized the extent to which the reduction in authorized border closings are impacting the humanitarian response. Humanitarian actors have to travel through much longer routes, through conflict areas, deal with armed actors. And so both the costs, the time, all is increased when you're restricting those closures.
And we know that Syria was recently elected to the World Health Organization's executive board. How will this affect the Assad regime's efforts to further centralize control over humanitarian assistance going through Damascus?
Yes, this is an issue that both the Syrian government and the Russian government have sought to push at the United Nations, which is that Syrian sovereignty should supersede the interests of international actors in providing cross-border aid. So that is the argument that the Assad regime uses. They say, Syria is a sovereign country. All aid should flow through the Assad government. Obviously, the United States and the international community disagrees on that front.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to Lebanon. If we could continue talking about this issue. Lebanon's hospitals were previously considered among the best in the Middle East. They're now struggling to pay staff and run equipment amid COVID and amid their economic freefall. Lebanese hospitals and doctors have reported shortages in vital medical supplies, and they've reported power outages, as well as the rejection or neglect of non-critical patients. What can the U.S. and others do to bolster the Lebanese health system, and how would a functioning Lebanese government enhance Lebanon's COVID response?
Yes, Lebanon is an extremely difficult case. What the United States has done so far is to provide aid directly to medical facilities, thereby bypassing the Lebanese government, and that reflects concerns that policymakers have regarding potential mismanagement, corruption, diversion of funds. And so the approach has been to work through local NGOs, to work through local facilities and provide the aid directly that way. Lebanon has been without a government for, I would say, about 10 months now. And the lack of a functioning government prevents Lebanon from accessing aid that is otherwise on the table. Donors have said that in order for aid to be provided, they need to see a functioning government, and that government has to have taken concrete steps for reform. So the United States and other countries are concerned about the condition of Lebanese civilians, but are reluctant to contribute further funds to a government that is not using those funds effectively.
Thank you. Lastly, let me turn to the West Bank and Gaza. Israel on Friday began transferring approximately 1 million Pfizer vaccine doses to the Palestinians. Unfortunately, it now looks like that deal might not proceed. with everything that's been going on there. Can you talk about the status of COVID in the Palestinian territories? And as we maybe touch on Gaza, is it possible to increase COVID assistance in Gaza without benefiting Hamas? Let me address that question to Ms. Moankar. Would you be able to answer those questions?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. Looking at the situation in Gaza, actually, and in relation to COVID-19, COVID-19 has severely aggravated the socioeconomic and the health conditions in both West Bank and Gaza. Looking at the latest escalations of violence, 113,000 people are now displaced. If you're looking, I mean, the rates of infections are getting higher. A small minority of the population, even in the West Bank, has been vaccinated. Even the health workers, who are a top group to be vaccinated, are not. All of them are not vaccinated. Looking at also the situation in the West Bank with restrictions on freedom of movement and limited access to resources and basic services, and this recurrent violence also that's happening, that has happened recently, this all is increasing, and the poverty and food insecurity. Hospitals, maybe I will describe a bit the situation in Gaza. It's civilians who borne the brunt of the latest violence. Immense amount of distress, pain, and destruction is seen in Gaza. Those who survived, actually, they have their scattered life to go on with. They've lost family members. They don't have access to basic needs and basic services, including health care. The only COVID-19 center, the main one that was doing testing, was affected by was destroyed, actually, during the hostilities, and the testing was seized. So access to drinking water, electricity is only is cut 14 hours a day in Gaza, where hospitals cannot function and really struggling with half and less of their capacities. So it's quite dire, the situation there.
Thank you. My time has expired. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Manning. Representative Perry, you're recognized for 5 minutes. You're still muted.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Now, Mr. Chairman and the witnesses, I certainly thank you for your presence today. Thanks for the hearing. I understand we're here to discuss the road to recovery for countries in the Middle East and North Africa. They, like many, have endured what the world has suffered on the effects of the coronavirus. Now, I think that America's generosity should rightly focus on those who need our assistance. But I think we got to be careful, and we can't allow our generosity to be corrupted by bad actors, especially those who wish to do America and America's interest harm. And so I want to point out a couple things, everybody. Hamas's Ministry of Information estimated that it needed $323 million to recover from last month's conflict. And I remind everybody, probably not that you need to hear it, but the conflict instigated by the Hamas terrorist organization. After 4,300 rockets were fired into Israel last month, let's just consider what the Palestinians were able to receive. $500 million from Egypt. These are all confirmed, by the way. $500 million from Egypt, $500 million from Qatar, $100 million from the UAE, $49 million from Germany, $100 million from Kuwait, and $10 million from Japan. And that doesn't even include the $5.5 million in U.S. disaster assistance that immediately followed the conflict from the United States, nor the restoration of $235 million in U.S. taxpayer dollars given to the Palestinians in April, nor 15 million provided to the Palestinians in March as humanitarian assistance, nor 32 million for United Nations Emergency Humanitarian Relief Campaign, all U.S. funds, all funds that could be used to help other countries, more helpful to the United States and our allies in dealing with COVID. All told, Hamas was able to see 4 to 5 times the amount they said it cost to rebuild the Gaza Strip. And to me, they're essentially solely responsible for what has been inflicted upon them. They're solely responsible. So to me, I hate to say this, but it's abundantly clear that the Biden administration is really willfully contravening established U.S. law and providing funds to the Palestinian Authority. As you know, the authority is on record as saying that if they're left with 1 penny, they will spend it on the family of prisoners and martyrs. They pledged to continue the pay-to-slay program in which terrorists are financially incentivized for killing Americans and Israelis. So my question to each one of you is, does anybody on the panel find it reprehensible that we continue to provide funds to the Palestinian Authority in violation of U.S. law? Hello, anybody?
Congressman Perry, thanks for the question, and I'll be brief. I know you want to hear from others as well, but look, I think you laid out very clearly what I'd call is a very tragic illustration of the humanitarian trap that the United States finds itself around the world, but Gaza is a great illustration of it, where a bad actor, terrorist organization Hamas in this particular case, picks a fight, causing terrible devastation among a civilian population that it is nominally in charge of. And then the international community feels obligated to come in and put the pieces back together again. It does provide for plenty of opportunity for diversion on the part of Hamas, and we see this in other theaters around the world as well. And so, yes, I very much agree that we need to be very cautious and careful in any kind of intervention there. And indeed, we need to be very cautious not to incentivize this kind of behavior, as this is not the first time Hamas has picked a fight, and the international community has then come in to attempt to rebuild afterwards.
Anybody else? And literally profit.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. For me, working in the humanitarian field, we've seen, actually we've worked in different conflicts, and basically it's as simple as that. Civilian population do not choose under which area or who controls the area they are living in. It's circumstances, it's the conflict. We work everywhere, you're faced with these challenges, different parties to the conflict. It's highly politicized environment, highly charged, and well, I wish in a perfect world where parties to the conflict would adhere to international law and make the priority for protection of civilian population and civilian infrastructure. But unfortunately, conflicts we're witnessing all over the world, and not only in Gaza and West Bank. This is not the case. These are challenges we're dealing with, but we should, and allow me to push for that as a humanitarian worker, we should push for the humanitarian imperative to be on the top of the agenda, especially in conflict situations. It's civilians, and the majority of them, women, girls, and children, who really pay the heaviest price of the conflict. So deciding on the assistance and the reach of the assistance should be based on the needs on the ground. And also, maybe I add furthermore, in regards to the way this aid is distributed, or how is it targeted, how does it reach to the really targeted population who are most in need. This is a collective work with donors, with partners, through a really rigorous due diligence process. But most important is for people affected by the conflict in Gaza and Palestine to receive the aid, and probably maybe to look at Gaza beyond the current conflict, to look at it as a political problem that needs to be solved, where diplomacy is involved to offer.
With all
the
due
people.
respect, we know that people
Thank you.
suffering under the pandemic need to receive assistance, and America can give it because we've been blessed with so much. But if they didn't start picking a fight with their neighbors every other few years and cause such destruction, not only to their own area, but to their neighbors, they wouldn't need the assistance from us. And it incentivizes them. You can see fivefold, it incentivizes them.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you, Mr.
Gentleman's
Chairman.
time has expired. Thank you, Representative Perry. And I'll go to Mr. Sherman after just pointing out the chair's view that not only is it's the Biden administration not violating United States law by providing humanitarian assistance, it is in fact living up to the best ideals of the United States of America, reflecting American values, just as the Trump administration did when it provided $5 million in international assistance for COVID relief to West Bank and Gaza. Mr. Sherman, you're recognized.
Thank you. One issue that goes beyond the Middle East is the fact that we've been wasting a lot of the vaccine. Now, this has not prevented Americans from being able to get vaccine, but we started by wasting a vaccine because the FDA announced that you get only 5 dosages out of a bottle that holds almost 7, and then after 5 dosages, throw the bottle away. We focused on that. We got them to change that guidance. But there's substantial medical evidence, as I brought out in the last full committee hearing on COVID, that if we administered a much lower dosage, we'd still get all of the benefit, particularly for those under the age of 55. Dr. Fauci's refused, at least initially, has refused to do the research, which, if correct, would allow us to double the amount of vaccine available because you'd only be administering half the volume. At our hearing, a coordinator from the administration claimed that this research was going on. I asked for details. We're still trying to get those details. But obviously, we should be giving the smallest effective dosage. I want to reiterate what Mr. Vargas said. For many years, Ed Royce, former chair of this committee, and I were pushing the concept of the flag on the bag. That's when aid was food and bags. And the U.S. flag on each vial would make an awful lot of sense. Focusing on just particularly on the Middle East, the Oslo Accords gives the Palestinian Authority control of and responsibility for health programs. And there's very few places in the world, I think perhaps none with the possible exception of U.S. aid to people governed by Hamas, where scarce vaccine is being given by one country to a group that's hostile to that country. China claims that the citizens of Taiwan, the residents of Taiwan, are citizens of its state, yet they are providing no vaccines to Taiwan. Russia's providing nothing to Ukraine. Turkey's providing nothing to Armenia. But Israel has stepped forward and offered 100,000 Pfizer dosages to the Palestinian Authority. These dosages will expire July 31. The Palestinian Authority has rejected those dosages on the theory that they can't distribute them all by the expiration date. But it's 100,000 dosages, and there are indications in the statements of the Washington Post that says the PA could deliver 60,000 dosages a day. So clearly, and this happens many times, the Palestinian Authority is more interested in condemning Israel than helping its own people, and is willing to incur civilian deaths for political reasons. So the question emerges, Mr. Ferguson, what other countries in the region we're talking about have the infrastructure so that if they got these dosages, they could administer 100,000 dosages before July 31.
Well, obviously the clock is ticking, right? And the logistics of transporting these doses much farther beyond the Palestinian territories is obviously a consideration, right? But look, the problem
is Egypt administering 10,000 dosages a day, 20,000 dosages a day?
Egypt could certainly administer 100,000. Absolutely, Egypt is one. I'd say more broadly, the problem throughout the Middle East is not so much infrastructure, certainly at the scale of 100,000, right? You could pick pretty much any country, except for the truly broken, Libya, Syria, etc.
Well, I'd hate to see these dosages go to waste. And it is a shame that the people of the West Bank have to have their lives endangered by their own governing authority for political reasons. And I'm confident that one way or another, these dosages will get into arms. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Sherman. Mr. Schneider, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I again want to thank the witnesses for sharing your perspectives with us today. I'm going to pull the lens back to look at the broader Middle East for a second, and I'm sorry if I pronounced this wrong, Ms. Is it Humud? You talked about in your remarks or in your written statement the impact on migrant workers not getting the vaccine, and a particular note. So I was looking at that. You said, for example, over 80% of the populations of UAE and Qatar, 70% in Kuwait, 55% in Bahrain. I mean, a majority of the population are migrants and not necessarily getting the vaccines where they work. And if they get sick where they work, being sent back to their home countries with virus and further spreading. Can you expand a little bit about that and what might the U.S. do to try to address that challenge?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, as you noted, migrant workers, and these are folks largely coming from Africa, Southeast Asia, do make up a majority of the population in some of these Gulf states. Some Gulf states like UAE have put forward new legislation that tries to sort of reduce some of the inequities that exist in the Gulf more broadly. But this is an ongoing challenge. I think raising awareness is one potential route forward, that even though these migrants are not citizens, these are populations that are integrated into the host country, and to encourage regional states to view this really not from a lens of nationality, but of shared health risk.
Thank you. And if I can bridge to that, because there are the regional issues. This virus doesn't recognize borders. But there's also the challenge, was mentioned earlier, China and Russia using their vaccine as soft diplomacy. The United States, and again, others have touched on this, we have the best vaccines so far with Pfizer and Moderna, J&J, et cetera. Reaching out to these countries, helping them get vaccinated, taking a leadership role, building the diplomatic capital, if you will. What should we be doing? And maybe Ms. Humud, I'll start with you and we can go on from there.
Sure. I want to touch on a question that was asked earlier about whether countries are reverting back to Pfizer vaccines after initially receiving a Chinese vaccine. I'd say yes, that UAE and Bahrain have done that. They initially received a Chinese vaccine, and going forward for their booster shots, they're looking to use Pfizer. In terms of what the United States could do, what I would note that in some cases is happening is that this goes broader than just vaccine distribution that Russia and China are doing. They're also looking to set up production facilities in some of these countries, such as Egypt, such as Morocco. And so I think a way to think of this is not just as a one-time vaccine distribution, but that Russia and China really are looking to set up long-term economic partnership. And that's something that potentially should inform a U.S. response.
Right. Ms. Moankar or Mr. Ferguson, anything you want to add to that?
Maybe I would like to add to the vaccine access and delivery. and I do believe the US has already shown great leadership in responding to the pandemic globally. However, we do see on the ground that the last mile delivery of the vaccine is failing around the world, at least in the MENA region, because low and middle income countries lack the health system infrastructure to really get shots in arms. So basically strengthening those health systems by investing in health workforce will also yield long-term benefits and better prepare the world to respond or hopefully prevent any next pandemic. So supporting low and middle income countries to combat COVID-19 is a natural, I imagine, extension of the US global leadership and is necessary to save lives in addition to the moral imperative. Though the US has also a health and economic imperative to help the rest of the world.
I'm sorry, I need to reclaim my time. I'm running out of time, but thank you. And I think there is an opportunity for the U.S. to lead here. And now narrowing my lens, we talked earlier, others have mentioned, you know, the tragedy of the vaccines. Israel offered 1 million vaccines to the PA, initially accepted and then rejected. The risk we face, not just with the PA rejecting vaccines from Israel for political reasons, but China and Russia using vaccines and building longer relationships, to get the politics out. And to the extent that the United States has the ability to lead in this region, to work with allies like Israel. It was the Pfizer vaccine that Israel was offering to the PA in an agreement. I think we can work to promote that. The vaccine, as I said before, it doesn't recognize borders. And you're seeing in Israel an increase in incidence of infections. I worry we'll see similar things here. We can't rest easy until the whole world is vaccinated, and the United States can take a leadership role, but we can't do it alone, and we have to work with our allies. But to the extent that we can work with groups like the PA to take away the politics and work with, in this case, Israel offering 1 million vaccines to vaccinate the people of the West Bank sooner rather than later. I think that's something the United States can have a significant impact, positive impact in moving forward. With that, I've gone over my time. I appreciate the indulgence of the chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Schneider. And I will now yield myself some time just to follow up on some of this. And again, I thank the witnesses. Ms. Moankar, I wanted to go back to your initial exchange with Mr. Vargas about women and girls. And in many countries in the region, women face greater COVID exposure. They're the majority of healthcare workers and home caregivers. They're less likely to have access to quality healthcare. And as a result, those who contract COVID may face greater long-term consequences to their health, partly because of the gender disparities in access to healthcare. Can you speak to additional steps that the international community can take to reduce exposure to COVID by women in the Middle East? How do we address and reduce the gender disparities in healthcare? And then, while we're on the topic of concerns about women and girls, to the extent that since there is this ongoing concern about increases in the incidence of gender-based violence, there's a lot more for us to worry about here. So, Ms. Moankar, let's start with you, and then Ms. Humud will go to you.
Thank you. I think, yes, the pandemic is really not impacting everyone equally. And we know that women and girls, particularly low income women and girls of color, are the one bearing the brunt of the secondary impacts of the pandemic worldwide. We are grateful to the investment that the U.S. has made and continue to make, but also further engagement with countries that are allied to the U.S. in the region to really integrate and follow policies and laws that really has a gender focus is very important. Access to these women and girls. Again, I will highlight the frontline healthcare workers that are the majority of them are women, and they're dealing with refugees and displaced within their communities. They're the reference for them. They're working almost without pay, without protection, without support, without training. Investment in that regard would yield really a great result, empowering those healthcare workers who are, 70% of those frontline healthcare workers are women.
Thank you, Ms. Moankar. Ms. Humud, is it right that if we make the appropriate investments, like Ms. Moankar just spoke of, if we make significant investments now in the midst of this pandemic, that we can actually affect more positive outcomes, not just in the immediate focus on COVID, but on starting to address some of these gender disparities that exist in healthcare?
Yes, I would agree with that. I would note that this in some ways highlights the intersection of gender and economics, right? So a lot of families who are marrying off their daughters who are girls, who are children, is because they can't feed them. And so I think it's important to see how these two areas overlap and intersect, and in some ways to improve some of these issues affecting women and girls is going to involve addressing the economic challenges faced by these countries.
And then finally, more broadly, and just in terms of the healthcare needs region-wide, Mr. Ferguson, I mean, COVID has exposed the challenges in healthcare delivery in our own country. But in the Middle East, perhaps even more so, we talked about the challenges throughout the region. We talked about what's going to happen if supplies can't come across the border into Syria. What have we learned already, even beyond these gender disparities? What have we learned in terms of healthcare needs in the region that we're going to have to continue to focus on even after people have been vaccinated and we've addressed this pandemic?
Sure. Well, I think one important conclusion from this pandemic was that even those countries with comparatively strong health systems, such as Jordan, right? Jordan's the destination for health tourism, as they call it, or at least was pre-COVID. Even those countries can face really severe breakdowns of the system under pressures of the pandemic. And so I'd say that going forward, important investments need to be made in the health sector around pandemic preparedness and more broadly. I'd go back, however, to my overarching point, which is ultimately these governments across the region, it's not just one, need to be more accountable and effective in allocating their resources, be it in strengthening stressed healthcare systems or promoting education systems that produce the kinds of workers that economies need. And ultimately, we need to get the economies up and running again, not just in the short term through boosting short-term assistance, but pulling out the red tape and reducing restrictions that allow the private sector to really take off there. That's going to alleviate many of these stresses we've been talking about, whether it's healthcare, governance, or others.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ferguson. Thanks to all of the witnesses for your participation today, for your testimony, for your insight. I want to thank all of the members who joined in, especially I want to thank Mr. Wilson for his leadership and continued commitment to these really critical issues. And with that, this virtual hearing is adjourned.